All right, we come now to the halfway point in Mark's gospel, and this is pretty significant. So to get there, we read 6, 7, and 8 today, and there's so much going on. This is where Mark's gospel just seems to fly through these miracle stories. I saw a video of a British guy, Alec. Oh man, I can't remember his last name. I should find this link for you because I want to get this. I don't know if the whole thing's on YouTube or not, but he recited the Gospel of Mark, and many scholars think that Mark's Gospel was written to be read out loud. And so to hear it out loud, even though it's, in the authorized version, 400 years old, it's just brilliant. And so, yeah, these things are trucking along here in chapter 6. Jesus is rejected in his hometown at Nazareth. He sends out the apostles to do their mission. John the Baptist is killed in prison. 5,000 are fed. Jesus walks on the water. He deals with the Syrophoenician woman. The deaf and a mute man are healed. Then the feeding of the 4,000 at the beginning of chapter 8. I mean, it's just flying here. And then we come to this complex of stories that really forms at least I think the narrative center of Mark's gospel. And I think it's really the theological center of Mark's gospel as well. Because here's what's going on. So first of all, you have the feeding of the 4,000, and then the feeding of the 5,000 was before that, right? So they get in the boat, and they're on the Sea of Galilee, and they're like, oh, man, we only brought one loaf of bread. Now remember, they collected 12 loaves after the 5,000 were fed, and 7 loaves after the 4,000 were fed, and somebody didn't do their job. You had one job. And they wind up with 1 loaf of bread for this trip across the lake. So, hey, they're hungry. What are they going to do? Not that Jesus has any pull after feeding multitudes twice. It's just a sort of an indictment on the disciples. And remember, Peter was probably the original storyteller of these things, and Mark is writing these things down. And I guess Peter's kind of outing himself and the rest of the disciples for how dull they were. So they think about bread, and Jesus warns them about the leaven of the Pharisees, which has nothing to do with real, yeast, physical bread. But he warns them about this, and they just don't get it. And they don't see that the one in the boat with them is capable of multiplying food because he is God. So they haven't figured it out yet. They're blind. Next story, blind man. Jesus heals this blind man at Bethsaida. And the way he heals him is so unique. It's like in stages. He lays his hands on the blind man, and the blind man says, oh, I can see men walking around like trees, like they're blurry. So please be careful with this. This is not a matter of Jesus like, oh man, I had my power setting wrong. This is a story that I don't think occurs in any of the other Gospels. I think that Mark is the only one that has it here. And I think it's for a theological purpose, because Jesus lays his hand on the man again, right? And his eyes were completely opened, and his sight is completely restored, and he finally can see. Well, that's going to happen to the disciples. We come now later in chapter 8 to Jesus' confession. You're the Messiah, Lord. He gets it right. And then, instead of saying anything else about that, immediately Jesus starts talking about his crucifixion. So here's and right before that, he tells them, don't tell anybody that I'm the Messiah. So way back in the 19th century, there was this theory about the messianic secret. And I won't take the time to explain it, but what's going on here is not that Jesus didn't know he was actually the Messiah, but rather that Jesus doesn't want the crowds to start labeling him as the Messiah because they have their preconceived ideas about what the Messiah would be. And you think Peter cutting off the guard's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was betrayed, you think that was radical? He would have had an army, and they would have rebelled against Rome, and it would have been bedlam and anarchy and disaster. So no, don't tell anyone what you've just said. Then we go on in chapter 8, and Jesus immediately starts talking about the cross. And that's because it is impossible to truly know Jesus in his person until you understand his work at the cross. If you don't understand him as the suffering Savior, the Messiah, yes, but the one who would suffer and die, and then he calls others. We're about to see that in chapter 9. He calls others come suffer with me. If you're not willing to do this, to take up your cross, you can't be my follower. So this is now going to shift the whole telling of the story. Up until this point, we've learned who Jesus is. Peter finally gets it. And now we're going to understand the significance of his going to Jerusalem and his death on the cross and his resurrection. That's why this is such an important chapter, chapter 8, as we're halfway through Mark's gospel.